Hello, listeners. It's time once again for another Campfire Ghost Story presented to you by the Malden Public Library. Today's story comes from The Haunting of America, Ghost Stories from Our Past by Jean Anderson. I know some of you are wondering why we would need yet another thing to scare us when the world is doing a fine job of keeping us on edge, to put it mildly, and it's a fair question. The truth is, horror has been used by many people for a long time as a way to work through fears and anxieties in a controlled setting. So, when reality closely resembles a hideous dumpster fire and you feel a near total loss of control of everything around you, it can help to let yourself get scared by something from which you know you are safe. And anyway, 'tis the season to be spooky. So, are you ready to take a ride on the fright train to soothe our trembling psyches together? Excellent. Then let's begin. The Lady in Black of Boston Harbor. She walks yet in Boston Harbor, the gallant lady in black. No one can predict when she will appear, or why, or what her mood will be. She is sometimes sprightly, sometimes dolorous, sometimes haughty, sometimes humble. Who is she? How did she come to haunt Fort Warren, a somber military garrison on the rocky outcropping of George's Island 7 miles at sea in Boston Harbor? It all began a little over 100 years ago at the outset of the Civil War, not in Boston, but in the little town of Crawfordville in the red, mud-baked hills of northeast Georgia. A young lieutenant there, Andrew Lanier, had been called up. Nothing very unusual in that. Thousands of Southern youths were being conscripted. Lieutenant Lanier, however, was to have married his childhood sweetheart within the month. Rather than wait for his first leave, or until the end of the war, he begged his intended to marry him at once. She agreed, and the two were married in a simple ceremony. They spent 48 hours together, then Lieutenant Lanier joined his division and rode off to fight the War for Southern Independence, as Southerners preferred to call the Civil War. In less than a month, he was captured and taken as prisoner of war to the corridor of dungeons at Fort Warren in Boston Harbor along with some 600 other Confederates. He wrote his wife a long letter explaining what had happened, although he never expected the letter to reach her. It did reach her, and her reaction, on reading the news, startled both her family and friends. They gathered around, overflowing with sympathy. But sympathy was not what she sought. It was support for a bold and reckless plan, a scheme so daring few men would have undertaken it. Young Mrs. Lanier was a lady far ahead of her time, decidedly not a frail Southern gentlewoman fluttering a fan or sniffing smelling salts at the onset of each sinking spell. Nor was she one to languish about the house, bemoaning her fate. Her decision was immediate. She would go to Boston, visit her husband, try everything within her power to secure his release. Her family and friends were aghast. Vainly they tried to reason with her. Did she not realize how perilous such a journey would be, and how futile any attempts to see her husband? No amount of reasoning or arguing or cajoling could dissuade her. She would go, she vowed. She arranged for passage aboard a blockade runner that would put her ashore near the elbow of Cape Cod. She had friends there, Southern sympathizers, who would help her travel north to Boston and carry out her plan. 2.5 months later, she was at Hull within full view of Fort Warren. Eager as she was to be reunited with her husband, she made her plans slowly and carefully. With a telescope, she studied Fort Warren in detail, noting the position of its corridor of dungeons where her husband was incarcerated. She noted, too, the sentry posts, the paths the guards patrolled, the height of the prison walls, and their distance from the shore. Finally, on a blustery January night, she was ready to set out. Friends rowed her across Hingham Bay into Boston Harbor, and then through black roller-coastering swells to George's Island. She had shorn her hair and donned a dark man's suit, the easier to scale the prison walls and slip undetected through the night. Once ashore, she crouched in the surf, waiting for the sentries to pass out of sight. She clocked their patrol once again to make sure she had not miscalculated. From the time the two men met, passed one another, disappeared, then turned and reappeared, she had exactly a minute and a half. In those 90 seconds, she must slip from the shore to the bushes massed around the base of the fort, a distance of 2 perhaps 300 feet. Once there, she would wait for the sentries to pass again, then, in that minute and a half, scramble over the walls into the courtyard by the corridor of dungeons. Stinging cold pebbles of sleet rattled down, but she welcomed the sleet because its sounds would muffle her own, and its slanting, silvery fall would provide a curtain of camouflage. Moreover, the guards were not apt to tarry on a night so raw, nor were they likely to expect an intruder. All went well. She stole during the first minute and a half across the grounds to the shelter of the shrubbery, then, in the second minute and a half, clambered up the rough stone walls and dropped with a plop no louder than that of an apple falling from a tree into the courtyard by the corridor of dungeons. There were no sentries in sight. She stood now, after so many months, within a few feet of her husband. Only the prison wall separated them. She examined it and saw that not 10 feet above there was a long, narrow slit. With luck, the signal she had planned would be heard. There was a folk tune the two of them had sung since childhood. She would whistle a few bars. Her husband, she knew, would recognize it and whistle back. But no answering whistle came. She heard only the rustle of sleet. Suddenly, for the first time during the entire hazardous scheme, terror clutched at her heart. What if her husband had died, or had been transferred to another prison? There was no way the news could have reached her. She whistled again, more shrilly this time, but heard only the frantic beatings of her heart. Then it came, muffled as if from the depths of a well, the next few bars of the song. Her husband had heard. He was safe. Again he whistled the snatch of tune, and when she looked up toward the opening in the wall, she saw snaking down from it a twist of bedding. She grabbed hold, was pulled up to the slit, then shimmied through. The next instant she was in her husband's arms, trembling and tearful. He was incredulous. How had she slipped through enemy lines and reached Boston? How had she crossed Boston Harbor to Fort Warren? How had she evaded the guards and stolen inside Fort Warren? She told her story not only to her husband, but to as many of his confederates as could crowd around. Then she produced the bundle that she had carried so protectively all the way from Crawfordville, Georgia. In it lay a pick, a shovel, a pistol, and a box of bullets. Her plan had been to help her husband escape, but the prisoners now hit upon a far more dazzling scheme. They would tunnel not out of the prison, but into the parade ground near the keep. There they would emerge, catch the guard off duty, seize the armory, and then the fort itself. Once Fort Warren had been taken, they would train its guns on Boston and very possibly change the entire course of the war. Week by week, inch by inch, the prisoners dug their tunnel, scattering bits of dirt onto the ground outside the fortress walls, but hiding more of it in their blankets and rolled-up shirts. At last they reached their mark, the center of the parade ground from which they would stage their attack on the armory. But as the pick swung up, it struck not earth, then air, but the wall of the keep. At the crunch of metal on stone, the guard spun around. He knew instantly what had happened. Troops were summoned and sent on the double to the corridor of dungeons. Just minutes from victory, the Confederates were doomed. One by one, they were led onto the parade ground and counted. 11 prisoners were missing, including Lieutenant Lanier. The 11 were quickly found, however, once the tunnel entrance was located and ordered to show themselves. "You might as well come out and surrender," the garrison's colonel commanded. "You have failed." The 11 holdouts crawled from the tunnel, but not before a final desperate plan had been agreed upon. The Union soldiers knew nothing of Mrs. Lanier, and therein lay their hope. When all of the prisoners had been led to the parade ground and accounted for, she would slip up behind the colonel, pistol cocked, and demand that he surrender the fort. The Confederates knew that he would do no such thing, but, they reasoned, in the instant he was caught off guard, they could turn upon their captors, disarm them, and take the fort. But it did not work out that way. The colonel, instead of being rattled by the surprise attack, coolly motioned his troops to circle around the mystery man in black. Shivering, less for fear of her own life than for fear that this plan too would fail, Mrs. Lanier stood valiantly, watching the ring of blue tighten about her. Then, more quickly it seemed than a copperhead could strike, the colonel snatched her pistol. It misfired, spattering shrapnel everywhere. One jagged piece caught Lieutenant Lanier in the temple, and he fell, mortally wounded. Mrs. Lanier crumpled to the ground beside her husband, sobbing hysterically. Only then did the Union troops discover the identity of the mystery man in black and hear her incredible, courageous love story. Few among them were untouched by the young bride's story, and yet she was a spy, and as such must be hanged. "One last request," she begged of the colonel. "I am weary of the men's clothes I wear. Let me go to my hanging dressed as a lady." The colonel granted the request. He had the fort searched for fabric, then presented the young bride with a black robe that had been used in amateur theatricals. From it, Mrs. Lanier fashioned a makeshift gown. On the morning of February 2nd, 1862, she walked to the gallows, wearing the black gown she had made and a faint, fleeting smile. That afternoon, the troops cut her body down and laid it to rest in a grave beside that of her husband. Her spirit, however, did not rest. 7 weeks after the hanging, in the deep of night, a sentry felt 2 hands around his throat, tightening, tightening, tightening. He wheeled about, and to his horror saw standing there a lady in black, bathed in miasmic light, her smile seeming to drift upon the air. It was Mrs. Andrew Lanier. In the beginning, the soldiers scoffed at the story, but then, one by one, others of them were visited by the lady in black as they stood guard duty. Her appearances were no longer taken lightly, nor have they been in ensuing years. During World War II, she so startled a young sentry that he remains, to this day, in a mental hospital. The lady in black continues to appear despite the fact that her remains, and those of her husband, have been removed to Georgia, and despite the fact that Fort Warren is today an historic site and tourist attraction. She is not seen weekly, monthly, or even annually, as one might suspect, on the anniversary of the hanging. When will she next walk, the lady in black? No one can say. Next week, perhaps, she will stroll the battlements, a slender silhouette suffused with spectral light. Then again, she may walk tonight. That concludes our story for today. A few notes before we part. Though I did read you a story from the perspective of the Confederacy, I want to make it absolutely crystal clear that the Civil War was fought because some people in the country wanted to continue owning other people. That's it. The Confederacy itself admitted proudly that it fought to keep slavery, to continue to treat human beings as goods to be sold and purchased. Anyone who tries to say otherwise can feel free to just hop right in the Wayback Machine and take it up with the Confederacy. Second, in my introduction, I talked about using horror as a way to experience fear in a controlled setting and to escape our external fears for a moment, and I stand by this, but I am in no way advocating inaction. We do not live in a controlled setting, and I'm glad that we could share this moment of escape, but that's what it was, a moment. We can't actually outrun our problems, and at some point, we need to stand up, turn to the monsters, and say that they don't get to write our story. We do. So, vote if you are of age and able. If you aren't, consider volunteering to sign people up to vote, or consider volunteering at polling stations. Listen to scientists and think very carefully about how your choices might impact others. Think critically about new information you receive. What is the source? Do they stand to gain something from telling you a lie versus a truth? Check the facts. Viruses and wildfires and hurricanes and droughts are not registered Democrats or Republicans or even members of the Green Rainbow Party. Be smart, be safe, we love you, and we'll see you next week.